Welcome, dear viewer. I hope you are having a wonderful night. Tonight, I'll be telling some terrifyingly scary stories. I hope you are warm and ready. Let's begin. At the time of the sleepover, it was me and my best friend, both ages 7 or 8. We are both now 16 and 17 and haven't talked about this incident since. We lived in Florida, about 15 minutes away from Tampa. It was one of our many sleepovers, and it was no different from others. We played with Barbies, watched movies, and read books until we couldn't take it anymore, and went to bed around 9 or 10. I turned off the lights and climbed up to my top bunk, where both me and my friend were going to sleep. As I lay down, something immediately didn't feel right. The house I lived in was relatively old, and our landlord sucked and never came to fix anything. Let alone, did he only care when our rent was due. Before getting in bed, I flipped on my fan and had my mom turn the act down. But as I got into bed, my fan was turned off, as was the act. But I thought the power went out and didn't think much of it. About 20 minutes go by and I can't sleep. And I feel like I'm dying of heat stroke. I'm not sure if my friend is awake, so I say her name quietly. She responds immediately, saying, "I can't sleep." But it's not because it's hot. I look over and can barely see her silhouette. I look up at the ceiling, sigh, and say, "What is it then?" She responds, saying it's the man in the corner. When I say I got chills, I got chills. I look over at her slowly, then turn my head to look at the corner. I thought she was lying, because I didn't see anything. I let out a breath of air I didn't know I was holding in. I go to adjust my blanket. And that's when I see him. A man, dark and tall, seemed to stare at both of us. I immediately gripped my friend's hand and closed my eyes hard. "We have to get my mom," I whispered, and I felt my friend nod, but we both lay there, unable to move. All of a sudden, I feel the movement of someone climbing up the ladder and crawling slowly. The blankets moved with the movement, and I slowly opened my eyes to watch the man slowly start to crawl towards us. I was gasping for air and looked over to see my friend watching, paralyzed from moving. I look back at the man and can only see his outline. No features. I hold my friend's hand tight and say, "Scream when I tap your finger." Barley got out in a whisper. She slowly nodded, and as I watched the man slowly reach for my face, I tapped her hand, and we both screamed bloody murder. My mom came running in no later than 20 seconds and turned on the light, and both me and my friend were holding each other and crying. There was no trace of the man, and my mom checked all the doors, saying they were locked and weren't even touched. We both slept on the couch that night, watching Barbie movies and holding each other tightly. To this day, I don't know what it was or who it was, but I will always remember the eerie feeling of death being close to my face. It has been a while since I posted a story about a suicide house, but I have had several requests for more stories about my experiences in the field of trauma scene work. If you don't know what that is, I used to lead a crew that would go in after a murder, suicide, unattended death, accidental death, fire death, or any manner of incident that caused damage to a structure and left behind a scene that the victim's family shouldn't have to see. Now, I know my stories are not scary in the haunted or serial killer type, but the fact is most people couldn't handle walking into a scene like many of the ones I've been on. We actually had to be very careful about how we trained crew members who worked on such scenes. It was often a volunteer basis for working on those types of scenes, meaning we didn't force anyone to go to a house where the dad killed all the children before blowing his brains out on the lazy boy. We just didn't start someone in training and then go, "Oh, by the way, we're going to a multiple homicide." Anyway, if there was a way to describe some of the sights and smells of doing this type of work, I'm sure you would see how truly scary or messed up this all is. First of all, I have to say that suicide is not glamorous, nor is it ever over for those around you. If you need help, please get help. Don't let your loved ones find you that way. It not only changes them, but also the feeling inside the house. Anyway, back to my story. This took place in the late 1990s, just before I got out of the field. We got a call to dispatch a crew out to a house, and we were told that there was an incident with at least one death. Sometimes it is given to us that way, but never like a real whole story. But sometimes we see the true story on the evening news, or from a neighbor who talks too much. We arrive at this modest house, which is not really a high-end home, but not a low-end either. It was a 2-story home about midway into a cul-de-sac street. As with some scenes, there is a cluster of neighbors outside looking at who we were and why we were there. The sheriff's department had just released the scene, so all of the crime scene investigators had already done their job. As I approached the house, I noticed a ton of what looked like bullet holes in the stucco, broken glass, and a long blood stain on the driveway. We went inside and had to suit up almost immediately, as the police had probably used tear gas. There were blood stains all over. It looked as if someone had been dragged through the house with blood gushing. And there were areas that had pooled up blood. Areas where things kind of looked like explosions happened, to which I assume flash bangs were used, or maybe the guy inside had shot up. Probably what strikes you the most in situations like this is how benign the underneath looks. I don't know how to describe it, but just imagine a place looking like the inside of a home molded out of the TV set of Full House. Now, imagine that same TV set with blood smeared and pooled, bullet holes, and tons of broken glass. I mean, they seemed like a very normal family. I remember in their living room a big blue woodcut sign that said, "Family." You know, before live, laugh, love, signs were in style, and under that sign were a bunch of family photos of kids, parents, Christmas, graduation, and vacations. Other things in the house were a wall dedicated to the dad's love of his sports teams, and pictures of him with his buddies at games and stuff. So, what happened? From what we pieced together from the news reports, neighbors who wanted to talk to us while we were cleaning his blood off the driveway, and from the scene itself, the dad went crazy. He had been talking about demons, not like I got my own demons, but actual demons. He was sure that he was being attacked by the devil, and that demons were trying to take the souls of his family. So rather than let the demons take his family, he killed them, and so they would go to heaven. He ended up barricading himself in the house. It looked like some family members tried to get away after being shot and stabbed, but one collapsed in the kitchen, one escaped somehow, and one was pulled out by the police. He ended up shooting back at the police, and the neighborhood was evacuated for blocks. We were not sure about all that as we arrived on scene much later, but that was what the people outside were saying. In the end, he escaped the house and ended up on the roof, still shooting back. The police shot him, and he fell from the roof, and that was his blood we were cleaning from the driveway. He murdered his wife. One of his older children later died in the hospital. One of the kids was killed inside the house. One escaped, and I think another family member that lived with them was unharmed as they were not at the house when this all went down. It took us a lot longer to clean this scene as there were so many holes, and we had to remove almost all of the carpet and soft surfaces due to the tear gas. It was a terrible scene inside. I know this might sound religious or whatever, but come across enough of these scenes, and you start to really believe evil does exist. One of my first jobs was as an after-hours janitor at Walmart. I worked from 9:30 p.m. to 6:00 a.m. when the manager got there. Now I was typically with 2 others, but it varied, and a few nights I was alone. One of the only things I found creepy was the warehouse downstairs. It was the same size as the actual Walmart. We had to go down there to grab the soap to run the machine we used to wash the floors. We rarely needed to, as there were a few left out for us. One night, I was there alone. I had used all the floor cleaner and had to go down to the warehouse to get some soap. It already had an eerie vibe to it. It was pretty dimly lit, honestly. I walked over to grab soap. This was around 2 in the morning, so I still had quite a bit more time. I was grabbing the soap when I heard echoing footsteps. I was the only one there. I walked out of the aisle to see what looked to be a mid-20s male. "Who are you?" I yelled at him, shivering. He said his name was Josh. This was his first night on the job. He was told to look for the other worker to get some assistance, and he was told that the warehouse was where we got soap, and also where the break room was. I was creeped out, but he seemed legit. He knew the manager's name and answered all the questions I asked him. We started working, and everything was going well. He took an hour break at 5, pretty much to get out of work early, and said he would see me tomorrow night. The clock hit 6, and soon after my manager arrived, I asked why he didn't tell me about Josh. He looked confused. The new night worker. What he told me made the hairs on my neck stand up. There is no new night employee. You were working alone tonight. Was someone here with you? I quit the job the next day and never went back to that Walmart again. I had previously posted this on another subreddit, but thought I'd share it here. This isn't a typical scary story, but just a really odd situation that happened to me back in 1997. In the late 90s and early zeros, I worked on trauma scene work. I was a supervisor of a crew that you never see or hear about, but what we did was go into homes, buildings, or structures after homicide, suicide, accidental death, and situations like that. Sometimes they were very gruesome, and sometimes it was as simple as removing a chair and cutting out the carpet. Oftentimes, it involved a lot of cleaning and removal to sanitize the scene, both visually and biologically. Our goal was to leave the scene as void as possible. If you didn't know what had happened there, you would just assume that it was under renovation. This one time, it was about midday, so not the usual middle of the night to come clean up after a dead body call. I don't know why the police and fire departments always waited till night to call us out, but I would say 80s of the time that is how it happened. The day was a bright, sunny, and not so warm day in a suburb of Los Angeles. I won't give the exact details of the location for privacy, or that I even remember exactly which street it was on, but I do know it was an older yet very wealthy area of Los Angeles. The kind of neighborhood where you expect doctors, business executives, or people in the entertainment industry to live. As we pulled up to this home, it was a huge spread of mid-century modern, with fancy landscaping and a long curved driveway. The place looked very well kept and was probably a showcase of the neighborhood back in the 1950s and 1960s. The typical scenario was that I, being the supervisor, would approach the door while my crews waited by the trucks. Since this was supposed to be a small job, we only had my vehicle and our service truck. I remember seeing an old, fancy Mercedes and what looked like an old Porsche in the driveway. There were no other cars, but maybe there were some in the garage that I didn't see. As I walked up to the door, an older woman answered my knock. She was probably in her mid-50s and very well made up, with lots of jewelry on, and she was wearing something that reminded me of Mrs. Roper from Three's Company. Not cheap looking, just not in the 1990s style. I explained we were here for the cleanup work, and I then noticed she had a drink in her hand, like a martini or something. Like I said, this was the middle of the day and probably before lunch. It is not unusual to find people drinking at a time like this. She leads me into this house. It's surprising dark and hazy, with cigarette smoke inside. Now, what happens next is really odd. The entire place looked like it was a time capsule from what we would now call the Mad Men era. The house wasn't what gave me the creeps, but as she is leading me to, like, a second den area, we pass through the front room, another living room, and a bar pool table area. Like I said, This house was huge, but there were a ton of people in it, and to describe them, they all looked like characters from some early 1960s movies. A guy with a sport coat, glasses, and boat captain's hat. A guy in a tuxedo. A lady wearing a fur collar, long evening dress. And other people there that looked like some weird college of mixed people from some dinner party set back in some Rosemary's Baby movie set. The number of people all throughout the house didn't add up. There were only 2 small cars in the driveway, and one could only fit 2 people. Where did all these fancy people come from? There was a low mumble of different conversations from all around, with only an occasional glance at me as we were walking over to the scene. I remember one of those huge old cabinets with a record player playing Johnny Mathis. I know that because the "it's not for me to say" playing on the record was like I was about to walk into the Twilight Zone. We finally get to the room where the suicide happened. There was a red velvet chair that the deceased was in, and it wasn't a gunshot, but I assumed it was a razor to the wrists. The lady is standing at the entry to the room. I am looking over the scene and telling her we will remove the carpet and remove and dispose of the chair, as it held most of the blood. She just nodded and still had her drink in her hand. I asked her if she could sign our work order and the release for disposal of personal property, meaning the chair. As she signs, she says, "When you and your crew are finished. Just see yourselves out." I told her it probably wouldn't take us more than an hour. She turned and walked away and back to her party. I make the journey back to the front door. Through the Johnny Mathis record playing, through the cigarette smoke, and through the low-toned party conversations. I go out to my truck and guys and tell them this one is creepy. There's a freaking party going on inside, and everyone is dressed up. I lead my crew back to the room and they start bagging up the chair and cutting out the old blue carpet. The black stains were where the blood dripped down through it, and we ended up just cutting out half of the room of carpet and making an even straight cut across the room to avoid having to move a lot of big old furniture. We never found out who committed suicide, but I assumed it was the lady's husband. As we were finishing up, I stayed behind in the room to take the final photos, as was our protocol to take before and after photos. I thought about looking for the lady of the house, just to let her know we were finished, even though I got the impression we were to do what we needed, then leave and not bother her again. I still just wanted to give her confirmation. So as I slowly walked again through the party areas, I noticed no one was making eye contact with me or even acknowledging my presence. You would think that if everyone at the party had known about the death, it would have been conversation or at least interest. I walked over to the front door, turned to look back at the party stuck in a time capsule, and closed the massive front door behind me. Driving away, I couldn't help but think, what a strange day. So bright and sunny outside. I wonder how many people knew we just cleaned up the remnants of someone's last moments on Earth. Some of my previous posts regarding my experience doing crime scene cleanup work, or trauma scene work as we called it, generated a lot of people messaging me and asking me to write up more stories from my past. I used to do this work in the early 1990s and ran into all kinds of situations, such as accidental deaths, suicides, fire deaths, explosions, homicides, unattended deaths, and pretty much any messed up situation that could happen inside a home or structure. One of my first calls when I started doing this work had to be around 1990. 1994. It was to a really, really rich fancy home. The home was located in a very wealthy area of Los Angeles, up in the hills, and it was a huge home with a lot of land surrounding it. This was the first time I ever saw an elevator in a home. I never met the homeowner or any representative from the person who owned the home, as all of the paperwork was done via fax. I think it was owned by an Asian family, but I couldn't be 100% sure. I only thought this at the time due to the furnishings and stuff inside the home. The home was pretty much emptied out of most of the personal contents prior to our arrival, so I didn't see any family photos on the walls. The home was so huge that you could get lost inside. Up to this point, I had never been inside a multi-level home, much less one with so many bedrooms, a game room, an indoor pool, a bar, dens, family rooms, basements, and if I remember correctly, a 6-car garage. Anyway, we started work on this one really late in the evening. It was once a crime scene, but by the time it was released to us, there were other damages that I couldn't explain. I assumed that the person was killed in the master bathroom, as there were some signs of trauma and some bullet holes in the bathroom shower and surrounding walls. Not much blood and that kind of stuff to clean up, as I think the person must have died in the huge walk in shower. What was odd was that I don't know if the shooter turned on all the water faucets in the house, because there was water damage all through the house, kind of like Home Alone, Wet Bandit stuff. There were areas where we had to remove wet drywall, wet carpet, baseboards, wood flooring, wet ceilings, and cabinets. Since this was all over this huge house, and my crew at the time was just about 5 of us, we split up and worked in different areas. This house was so big that you couldn't hear each other from different areas, even if you were screaming. But we all carried these old Motorola talkies that we could call and communicate with each other for miles. One of the issues we were dealing with was that in certain areas of the house, the lights were off. I think prior to us coming out, an electrician shut off power in different areas because electrical components got wet. We all decided that using the elevator wasn't a good idea, so we just used stairs, and walking through the different areas of the home was completely dark. We thought about using our generator, but the house was too big and there were so many rooms, so we just ran extension cords with light to areas we needed. But this still didn't light up enough of the house. I remember 2 of our guys were working on the upstairs. I think you would call it the 3rd or 4th floor, the area where the murder took place. Another guy was working by himself in what looked like a bar indoor nightclub area, removing wet cabinets and flooring. Another guy was working on this huge walk, in closet, tearing out wet carpet and drywall from floor to ceiling. I started working in a basement area where there were some ceilings and walls that needed to be removed. This job was going to be an all-nighter because of the vast areas and multiple areas where all the damage was, and we kept finding more and more. Also, everything that we removed that was damaged was a long trek to take it out of the house and down the drive to our trucks, adding to the time it took. So why is this a scary or creepy story? Well, imagine being in this huge home where a murder took place for one, but as we got on through the night working, we started hearing and experiencing things. Our old radios would do a beep chime when someone was about to say something over the air. Since it was only our company that had these radios, it wasn't random interference from outside sources, and we hadn't experienced such things before. But as the night went on and we were working, we kept getting alerts that someone was about to talk. So I and others would drop what we were doing and listen for someone to say something. But no one spoke. Okay, so maybe the guys were fooling around with the radios. I was making my way with a trash can of debris out of the basement, as I didn't want to make my trash too heavy to carry out. I made several loads, and it was a summer night, so getting out in the cool summer air was also a benefit. On one of these trips, I had to go up the stairs from the basement and down a long hallway. I believe to my right was an opening to a large living room, type room, and to my left were some windows to the outside. But further down was the door that I needed to take to exit and take my debris out. On one of these trips, the lights all went out. I got some light from the moon outside, but to my right, the rest of the house seemed unnaturally dark. As I made my way back to the truck, I grabbed a small flashlight in case this happened again. After a while of working in the basement area, one of my guys comes up to me and starts chatting. I can tell he's nervous, and he starts on me, saying, wouldn't it be better if we worked together? That way, we can finish up areas quicker. I could tell he didn't want to be by himself. So I agreed, and honestly, I knew how he felt. At about 1 a.m., we all decided to take a break and meet in the pool table room to eat and take a break. We started exchanging stories about the place. mostly on how cool it was, but also on how creepy it was. And we all experienced random whole sections of the house losing power only for it to come back on again. Then a different section. The guys that were on the upstairs part talked about hearing music, but couldn't find the source. I brought up who the dumbass is who keeps hitting the talk button. No one did. We started coming to the realization that this job wasn't going to be completed tonight, and that it would be a 2 or 3 day job. We talked about our options, and one of them was that since it was nearly 2 at that point, we should work a few more hours, sleep there, get up, go shower, and go back to our office. I, for one, wasn't into the idea of sleeping in that house and overruled and said we would work a couple more hours, then call it a day. The following day, we already had another job on the books, so we got home and rested a little before going back at it. We got back to the big fancy house about 3 p.m. and decided to work as long as we could, then finish it up the following day. That evening, we sent one of the guys for pizza, and we kept working. So there were 2 of us paired up, and when the pizza came, we would break up, eat, and rest up a bit before going back to it. I know this is drawn out, but for the things that happened next to this day, I am not sure if it was us being super tired and sleep deprived, or if something else was going on in the house. After we ate our dinner, and once again were back in the pool table room, we were just relaxing as the work and distances in this house took a toll on us. We decide the best case, so no one of us gets too tired lugging the trash, and we split that duty. One guy will go, then come back, and another guy will go and come back, and so on. Almost everyone hears music playing at some point in the house. I heard it walking down from the kitchen area to that long hallway, but it sounded like it was coming from another location in the house. Another guy heard it coming from upstairs in the master bedroom area, but when you got up there, it sounded like it was somewhere else. Okay, just music, no big deal. One of our guys called us over the radio as he was making his way back from taking debris to our trucks and said, "Hey, was someone over in the kitchen pantry room?" We were all saying no, and why. He said the door was open, but it wasn't before. It was about midnight at this point, and I was working in one of the extra bedrooms that had its own private bathroom. This area was down a long hallway that had a few other rooms and ended in a den-type area. I was with one of my guys, and we both jumped as we heard a loud bang. It sounded like something big and flat hit the ground, kind of like if you knocked over a large piece of furniture, and I got on the radio and checked on my guys, thinking they broke something, and everyone said no, that they hadn't broken anything, and no one else heard it. My coworker and I sure did, so we went down the hallway and looked around. Maybe a picture fell from the wall or something fell over. On one of the last trips from that area, my coworker took the debris to the truck, and I was left alone in the room, waiting for him to return, and the lights to go out. I am sitting here in this room in the dark. All down the hallway, it is pitch dark for some reason. Not even enough light from the moon. He took our flashlight with him. I start to make my way out of the room, going down to the den area that leads to a larger open room. Then from there to a living room and dining room. Then on to the kitchen, and I start to see light from the pool table room. So I start to make my way over there, and those lights go out. I get on my radio and call out that all the lights on the second floor are out. I start to hear someone walking towards me coming from the living room area, and thinking it was my coworker, I call out to him and don't get a response. I stand there in silence. Then I start to see a flashlight moving around, and it's another coworker. He said that in his area, the lights were on, and I hear me yelling for him. I didn't yell. I only called on the radio. Just as we are talking, the lights come back on. My coworker with the trash can comes back in, and the flashlight comes back in. The last and final day we go out to finish. I canceled our schedule so that we could finish the job in the light of day. No more evenings or middle of the night working or being in that house. After we were all done, we started exchanging stories about it, and one guy said that he swears he heard me yell for him. I promise, I didn't. Probably because I was frozen. The lights were turning off and on everywhere. It wasn't like an electrical issue. But someone was messing with us. One guy said he went to use one of the only functioning restrooms and saw someone walk by when he opened the door, and it wasn't one of us. One of our guys claimed he heard footsteps in another room. We all heard the music. And one thing about the music is that we all heard a different type. I heard what sounded like classical music like Chopin or Mozart. Another one said it sounded like country music, but he couldn't make out the lyrics. And yet another heard what sounded to him like mariachi music or something you would hear in a Mexican restaurant. We were all like, what was that about?